right, well, I'm going to start. Welcome and hello, everybody. I'm Stephanie Pedroza, Senior Marketing Manager at Aurigo Software Technologies. And I want to thank everyone that's joining us today in Aurigo's first webinar of the year. Aurigo has worked with capital owners for about 2 decades now, and the issue of gaining accurate public feedback comes up frequently when speaking to our customers. We understand that public engagement is a crucial component of capital program delivery. That is why last month we launched Aurigo Engage, a public feedback tool designed to collect feedback early in the capital planning process. If you'd like to learn more about Aurigo Engage or any of our other tools, you can check us out online at www.aurigo.com. And in today's webinar, industry experts will share the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to gaining richer feedback from your constituents. A few quick notes before we get started. The webinar will be recorded and we will provide all registered participants with the recording. The slides will also be provided to all registered participants. We also ask that you please submit any questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A chat box below, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to all the questions during the available time, we will follow up with you via email. And joining me today is my colleague and marketing director, Richard Kramer, who will be moderating today's webinar. Hello, Richard.
Afternoon, Stephanie. Great to be here.
Awesome. And before we get started, I am going to launch a quick poll just because we want to see who's in our audience. So launching now, and please let us know. The first question is, which of these best describes your primary role? Are you in charge of community engagement, capital planning, project management? So I'll run the poll. Oh, wow. A lot of community engagement, project management. Okay, so it looks like it's spread out around there.
Yeah, that's good. It's kind of a broad topic, so it doesn't surprise me we have folks from the project side, the sort of pure capital planning side, and then specifically folks who are involved with community engagement. Looks like it's split up a third, more or less between those three groups. Yeah. That's great.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to close the poll now. And if you guys want to see the results, share it for a couple of minutes just so everyone can see who's there. Cool. Now I'm really excited to introduce our panel of experts. We have the Secretary of Louisiana Department of Transportation and the AASHTO President, Dr. Sean Wilson. He's a tireless advocate for new revenue, maximizing federal dollars available to Louisiana, advancing a balanced and comprehensive transportation policy for the state, and ensuring the department is more collaborative in its work at every level. As the AASHTO president, he emphasizes on creating pathways to equity and supporting partnerships with other organizations. His public service career spanned for more than 20 years. Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And next we have Jennifer Cohen, CEO of Leadership Delaware and industry leader at Aurigo Software. She led the Delaware Department of Transportation under 2 governors, where she led agency-wide reforms and produced the largest capital program in the state history. Prior to her appointment as secretary, Jennifer served as a director of Delaware Division of Motor Vehicles as the first woman to do so. Her state public service career spanned for more than 30 years. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's excited to be here.
Awesome. And finally, we have Kyle Schneeweiss, CEO of High Street and former director of Nebraska Department of Transportation with over 15 years of experience in the public sector industry. During Kyle's time at Nebraska DOT, he spearheaded merging the former Department of Roads and Aeronautics to create a multimodal Department of Transportation. He managed the most extensive natural disaster in the state's history in the 2019 floods, after which NDOT restored 200 miles of roadway and 27 bridges in just 11 months. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm always glad to see my friends Sean and Jen.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you guys, and this is such a great panel. And now I'll hand it over to Richard.
Thank you, Stephanie. A very warm welcome from me to everybody in the audience here with us today. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Public participation is such an important topic because it's so fundamental to how we organize ourselves as a society. I'd argue that democracy itself is sort of underpinned by this notion that the public has the right and the expectation to participate in conversations about decisions that interest them or affect them. So it's a topic that's high on the agenda for many of our customers. Now, I'm going to use the terms public participation, public feedback, community engagement fairly interchangeably for the purposes of today's discussion. Obviously, there's some nuance to those exact terms. But I think in terms of capital construction, capital planning, and capital maintenance, there's often two flavors, I think, of participation. One is getting input or an approval for your actual capital plan. So it's in transportation, this is usually a TIP or a STIP, and getting that approved. That often has a lot to do with funding, where's the funding coming from, and so on. And then there's also feedback on particular projects. So you have a large initiative, like a new bridge, a new city park, what have you, and you need specific feedback on everything from the location to the timing of it and what it's going to look like and so on. So I think we're going to hit both of those aspects in our discussion today. And on the screen, you can see the topics that we're going to cover with our panelists. It's supposed to be fairly informal. So as we go through, if you have a question for the panel, as Stephanie said, just put it right into the chat box there. And we'll do our best to get to everybody in the time that we have. So before we dive in, Stephanie, I think we have one more question we'd like to ask our audience. You're on mute.
Sorry, technology, gotta love it, right? So let me run the other poll question. So the next poll, it's what has been your greatest challenge with public feedback? So we want to know what challenges you're seeing in your agency. Is it not getting enough feedback, ensuring equitable participation, analyzing the data received, communicating expectations back to your constituents? Okay.
Interesting. Not getting enough feedback is taking the lead.
Uh-huh.
With equitable participation close behind.
Yeah, so definitely the top two, it's not getting enough feedback and equitable participation. They're pretty much neck and neck together.
Interesting.
I'll wait a couple more because there's still a couple of people. So we definitely want to know what your challenges are. Okay.
Interesting.
I'm gonna end the poll and share results. So if you guys can see results, it looks like ensuring equitable participation is probably the biggest struggle, which is something that, you know, our panelists are going to be talking about.
Definitely. All right, great. Thanks everybody for putting that in. Okay, so let's dive right into the discussion. As I've said, I mean, it's a critical piece of the puzzle in delivering public services. And so what we've done is grab some headlines and some data on the slides to help sort of set the stage for each of our topics. So for example, the middle headline there is actually from a public agency in the Northeast who a couple of years ago, right as the pandemic was sort of kicking off, they were getting feedback and they had to switch to sort of a virtual setting. And then they ended up getting wrapped over the knuckles by at least one reporter for they felt they weren't sharing all the public feedback. So they kind of cut out the last part of the meeting or what have you. And this caused a bit of a hoo-ha. So I think it's a broad topic, but it's a difficult topic. It's a topic that when I've been speaking to our customers, it's something that people really think about a lot and really noodle on, and it's not easy. I don't think there's any silver bullet, but the great news is that all three of our panelists are or have been heads of major public agencies. So Sean, I'd like to start with you. At the sort of head of a DOT level, how do you look at public engagement? Why is it important, and how do you manage it?
Well, great question, Richard. You know, public engagement for me is essential, not just in terms of making decisions about projects, but about managing expectations and delivering for our constituencies. Without it, there's a gap in what we see as priorities. As transportation professionals, we look at our asset management plans and we say, this is important. We look at our capital improvements program and say, this is a mega project that they really want. If we aren't connected with what people are saying and feeling and thinking about this, we're going to go about doing what's important to us and not what's important to our constituents. So for me, public engagement is fundamental to everything that we do because that's who we work for and who we work with. I will tell you, as secretary, I take at heart making sure we promise things that we can deliver and that we deliver what we promise. And I will always participate. Example, tonight, we've got a mega project here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And as secretary, I pride myself on not necessarily making every last one we have, but those most critical projects, I have to be there and put a face on the project. That's important because there's this moniker of public trust when you have a person and not someone new tomorrow, not someone new next year. And so for me, it allows me to do a better job managing my people, to say what I've heard and what I've witnessed and what I've reviewed, because it's not practical for a CEO to read all of the feedback and reports. And so it's good to get a little sampling of what people are saying and thinking, because I can do a better job managing it. The other piece I'll tell you is I think it's one of those things that has become a little stale. We have a highway priority program or a transportation public hearing that's done by our legislature where they travel around and it becomes a routine process and it's not really rich. It doesn't factor in new technologies or the new patterns of our workforce. But fundamentally, it creates some distrust because people come and they talk about the same project over and over again, and there's never the exchange of giving people what to expect, when to expect it, and be able to manage those expectations. So it's absolutely fundamental to what we do. It shows great opportunity for growth for us as a department and for all of our industry, especially given the use of phones and technology and social media to assess what people are thinking and seeing, such that we get a much more robust conversation about a transportation project.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Those are all great points. Jen, I'd like to ask the same question to you. Just how do you define it at a high level, and what are the key points?
Yeah, it's tough. It really is tough. I mean, first, you've got to have a project prioritization process that the public understands. And quite frankly, when you're dealing with some of these, long-term 6-year, 10-year, 20-year long transportation plans, people have to understand, what takes priority. And I can tell you, and I love when Stephanie used the term, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's still this way in some states. It was this way in Delaware up until almost 2015 is, whoever squawked the loudest, whichever legislator,
right,
was in running for governor or whatever it happened to be, they would end up, their projects would end up going to the top. And that's very hard. And you heard, Sean talk a little bit about that public trust. And having that prioritization process that the public absolutely understands and know what level that they play in that process. What I've seen that's happened in the past a lot of the times is, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more later in the webinar, but where agencies just check off a box. The feds say I have to have public engagement, so I do a pop-up meeting at a firehouse and 2 people show. Those days are gone. That is no longer, that's just no longer acceptable. So I think that, first that prioritization process that the public understands, and then really focusing on going to where the public is, especially those that are vulnerable populations and, haven't always been looking at the projects that are going to impact their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about managing expectations. What Sean said. I think that there's also a piece of just managing the perception of in order to build that public trust. Carl, what about you? How do you look at the topic broadly?
Well, I think the expectations piece is important, and I would like to share a little bit of what I've seen work. And I've seen it work in Midwest states, and I'd be curious the reaction from Sean and Jennifer about whether it would play well in their parts of the country. But when trying to sort of set the expectations about which projects are coming and how we're going to select them, I have seen states that travel around and hold regional meetings, and actually, they got the project list up there, and they got the scores that are based on all of the engineering and the safety things that we consider and economic benefits and all that stuff, sort of like how it would maybe score out in general if the DOT was going to pick them alone, and then gotten the group into some small groups and given them a fake budget and said, which projects you going to pick? And then they have to report those out to the large group. And what happens is people start having those trade-off discussions right there in the room. It's almost like they're working at the DOT, and the DOT learns from it, right? They learn from the conversations, but you get a lot of credibility back because folks now understand what the process is like and how hard it is, and some of those trade-offs, you'll see an advocate for a project and they just realize, it just doesn't rise up compared to some of the other needs. And so they almost can come to some of those conclusions on their own. And I've seen it work very well. And the reason I'm curious about asking Jennifer and Sean about it is because I have pitched that to some folks in the Northeast, and they told me that would never play here. The small groups would combust before they would ever agree on anything.
That's true. That's totally true, Kyle. And but there is that opportunity, and this has worked well in Delaware, especially in our resort beach areas. Is what we, as DOTs, what we typically do is like we have, okay, here's this project. We have 5 different alignments, 5 different options, and we take those 5 options, and then we go out to the community and say, hey, which one do you like, or which one is the least impactful to your community? But we really need to flip that on its head, Kyle, kind of like what you were saying, but in reverse. Go out to the communities ahead of time and say, hey, how would you help us solve this issue? And instead of just saying, here's your options and that's it. So I think there's something to that. But yeah, and I can tell you in the Northeast, after the fact, that I don't know, and I wouldn't want to lead that one, I can tell you that.
I would just say Civil War, Kyle. That's we've done that a little bit with our legislature, because our Joint Transportation Committee, they actually approve our highway priority program. They cannot add projects to the list that comes back to them, but they can take projects out. And so we've on occasion had the recommendation or the suggestion, you should be doing this. And we said, okay, we can do that, but here is the budget petition that governs what's going in capacity, what's going in preservation, what's going in safety, what's going in bridge. We let them see those numbers and say, okay, which project do you want us to cancel? And we reveal whose project that is. And the politics of that argument is that we want you to make an engineering decision. We don't want to have anything to do with it. So I would carry your recommendation a step further to say, just let them play with the budget petition as an exercise online to say, I've only got this much money, and here are the things that I have to do, and here's what's left. And you figure out which categories, and then you reveal at the end of that game which projects would or would not get done based on the need, because they tend to forget. As a DOT secretary, you might have 16,000 miles, 64 parishes. I'm not working in just your parish that has 150 of those 16,000 miles. And they all have the worst roads and the worst bridges, but they're only thinking about their own roads and their own bridges and not the entire state. So I like your idea. I do think it'll stoke a civil war, but there's a way to let them play with the budget, because at the end of the day, the planning decisions are going to reflect financial priorities, or vice versa. And if they have that little squiggly line to move around and say where their priorities are, but you can't increase the amount, then you get some reality checking going on.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. And Richard, the only thing I would just add is, it's important when we think about our capital programs that it's, we've talked a lot about sort of how do you figure out which projects go where. Obviously, we know how important public involvement is when you're dealing with the development of an actual project, but we can't forget about it during construction either. Sometimes I think that happens, and there's no bigger way to lose credibility than to get out there and be turning dirt and start impacting people's lives in a way that they weren't expecting, because you didn't communicate it to them again as you're getting ready to do that work. And so, that means project managers, field staff, they've got to be a part of that team and be, not only trained to do it, but the expectations for them needs to be out there that, hey, we expect you to be talking to those landowners, those businesses all along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I was impressed there were so many people in the audience from the project side, because it just shows that it's important all the way through the life cycle. Absolutely. All right, excellent. So we'll move on to our next topic. And folks in the audience, as part of the preparation for this webinar, we collected some initial thoughts from our panelists. So that's what you see up on the screen right now. And we'll be sending the presentation out, as Stephanie said, as kind of a recap. So look for that in your inbox in the next few days. Okay, so specifically we want to talk about some of the stuff that's been happening just in the last while, right? So obviously we've all been impacted by the global COVID pandemic. That's definitely shaken things up for a lot of public agencies. At the same time, we're seeing an increasing use of technology to solve some of these issues. We are maybe seeing a little more divisiveness in our communities around some of the issues. So, Carl, I'd like to start with you on this one. What have you seen recently in the last 12 to 24 months around public engagement?
Well, I think what I've seen is a continuation of a longer trend where the tone that we take when we have these conversations has improved a little bit, of how, Jennifer, you talked about the timing and how when you show up sort of matters. I think we've come a long ways as an industry in hosting these kinds of conversations in a way where we are open, and we're not rolling out the set of plans and saying, look at how great our engineering design is, now tell us how great we are. Instead, we sort of meet ahead of time. Who do you want to be as a community? We're coming through town in a few years. How do we sort of integrate who you want to be into our projects? So the timing and that tone, I think, has improved. And that's a great thing. And Stephanie, you mentioned the flood in Nebraska in 2019. When we had 27 bridges out sort of overnight, we right away the next week we were out doing public meetings at some of the hardest hit areas. And that was we didn't have a lot of time. It was using up very valuable resources from our team but we felt it was so important because we needed to experience and see these people where they were so we could understand the impacts. And that timing proved critical because we were learning about, folks who had a 90-minute detour around the bridge because the next bridge is that far away. Wow. And before they could get to school in 5 minutes. Wow. And so, as we have these conversations, there's tears, there's hugs. It was very memorable. And what it did was it helped us prioritize. It also helped fuel us as we were going through that process of delivering those projects. When the time got tough, and it did get tough for us, we could remember that it's not only us, it's them too, and we've got to deliver. And I remember there was one particular project where we left saying, they really need us to open by school, and that's not very long. And the contractor said, yeah, I don't know, that's going to be tough. But we just kept pushing, and we opened 2 days early before school. And it was, I guarantee you, is because we showed up at the right time, we had the right conversations. We had that mindset that we can do this on behalf of those folks. And so the timing and the tone really matters. And I think we've seen a lot of progress in that area of late, and I think we can only get better.
Yeah, great story. Jen, same question to you. What's been going on the last short while since the pandemic and everything?
So what we're seeing, and seeing two different trends in my opinion, the utilization of technology and the public demand for transparency. I'll give you just on the transparency side, and what we did in Delaware is we actually have an app. It's the Del Dot app. Anybody can go down and download it. Everything that the department was doing is on there. So descriptions of every single project. There's a calendar of events for whatever hearing we're going out, wherever in the state we are. We had that because again, I think Kyle brought up this point is, talking to everybody, before construction. Sometimes these projects don't go to construction for 5, 6, 7, sometimes even 10 years. So making sure that you have that transparency, and I mean in everything too, not just your capital planning. The community really wants to be involved. So we added a report a road condition. So, hey, there's a dead deer in the middle of the road, come pick it up, or hey, there's a pothole here, and they want that real time, transparency. And then the use of technology with the public hearings. I always believe that you never waste a good crisis. So I think the virtual town halls and the virtual hearings are here, and they're here to stay. And there's so much technology. You can actually even, walk, the participants and say a town hall on a new mega project, virtual reality, and show them exactly what it's going to look like, the exact impacts that it's going to have. So I think that both transparency, the demand for transparency from the public, as well as the utilization of technology to talk to the public about the transportation project and being able to see it is a huge benefit for those that are going to be impacted by the project. So those two things I think are a trend, and that we're going to see that continue.
Great. Yeah. I'm in Georgia. I'm about an hour north of Atlanta. I've actually used that reporter an issue thing with Georgia DOT's website, because there was like a mini flood and it flooded away part of a road that is near my house, and used that about a couple of years ago, actually. Sean, what about you? Either in Louisiana or as AASHTO head, like what have folks been talking about in particular in the last couple of years?
From a Louisiana perspective, I think the format of our public engagement has changed, and it's given us a much richer pieces and bits of information. So instead of having just a hot mic that people are either wanting to dominate and just vocalize and hear themselves talk and intimidate others from speaking, the idea that we can have an open house and we staff it properly with people covering different aspects of a project, we actually engage in education as well as soliciting feedback from people. So not only do we ask them what they want to do, and we then tell them why that is an important element. So when you look at sound walls, for example, we're looking at acrylic sound walls for a major project. We actually let them touch the material and we talk about the benefits of what's there and why we are suggesting that versus something else in terms of it being on structure and the impacts of light and engaging folks. So that's one piece of it, is that the format is much more valuable to really get their information and incorporate it into the project. That's one thing that's happening. The second thing I think is social media has really taken off in terms of asking for folks and putting in live FaceTime a public meeting so that you can see what's going on and be engaged in that space. I'll challenge folks to say we should do something different. And I've asked our people to start doing this for these mega projects that are so far out in advance. We've got some projects that we're going to construction in the next year and a half. So this may not be appropriate, but for other projects that are much earlier in the NEPA process, talk to the younger generation, talk to the kids about what kind of community they will want with this project, because it's going to be another 10 years before it gets built, and they'll be adults by that time. They'll be in the workforce by that time. They'll be driving or using transit or walking or biking in a project. And so targeting that population is a lot different than saying, let's just talk to folks who can come between 5 and 7 p.m. and disregard what's happening in their real lives. And so those are the things I think that are happening differently. And then, as Jen said, the virtual town halls, I think what we've learned through COVID and how best to communicate, I think that's going to be here to stay for a long, long time. It's much more efficient. It's a little bit more expensive, a little bit more time consuming to roll it out the right way. But man, you sure do get so much more input. That we did an assessment where we had our road shows virtually. We actually had more participation in the virtual session than we did for the last 2 sessions previously in the previous 2 years of in-person traveling. It was a lot cheaper because we didn't have to put people in hotels and move them around. But man, we had a lot more participation.
Yeah, it's interesting how, one of the, I don't want to call it a good thing, but one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is just forcing folks into exploring alternative ways to work together. We see that just at Aurigo with how we had to go remote and still remain productive, and I think that's affected everybody. So things like it's pushed us down this path of being more efficient and more digitized, I guess. So it's very interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned the getting feedback from kids as well. I saw a presentation not so long ago from someone who was a community planner specifically focused just on getting feedback from kids anywhere from 6 years old to sort of 18, I guess, leaving high school for that same reason. And she had the opinion that kids get to, I almost mentioned it like 5 minutes ago, kids are better at coming up with solutions and avoiding conflict than adults. That was her whole point of her whole presentation, which I thought was quite funny. It was like, kids are great. They just sort it out. They kind of say what they think, and there's no hard feelings afterwards.
Richard, one thing I would add to that I see is different is when you look at the makeup, the demographics of who's participating in our public meetings now, I think that's changing, and it's a much better situation because the social grassroots movements that we found ourselves in, they're more engaged and more plugged in at helping their membership and constituents plug in. So we're getting more people come to our sessions that we've probably never spoken to. I know for a fact I've engaged with 2 homeless people at a public meeting that had opinions about how we build interchanges and what's good for them and what's not good for them. And it was really, interestingly enough, not about the urban camping experience, but it was about safety and how someone who has to stand out there and beg, what are their safety concerns? And that's a pretty interesting dynamic to talk about.
Yeah.
But the idea that they came in from the element and decided to participate in the meeting was so refreshing. I don't think anyone sent him there. I think he stumbled across it in that instance. But the idea that I'm seeing a physical difference in the populations of the people that we're talking to, and that's very encouraging. And I don't know that I can attribute it to anything that we're doing as much as it is things that are happening around us.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our third topic, which is all about ensuring equitable participation. I think one of the key aspects of good community engagement is making sure that you're getting as broad a perspective as possible. And of course, historically, we haven't always done a good job of including everybody in the process, particularly communities of color, but also folks with disabilities and other groups that are easy to marginalize if you don't watch it. So, and again, with this infrastructure bill coming out, we've seen a lot of talk about it. Forbes, you see on the screen, put out an article on it about 18 months ago. So Jennifer, I'd like to start with you. What can agencies do to ensure equitable participation?
Sure. No, and thank you for this question, because it's one of the things that's near and dear to my heart. It was my platform as ITS America chair. We don't do a good job, and and if anybody who runs the transportation agency out there is saying that you do a good job, then you're wrong, because this needs to be targeted, right? And I'll take us back to the 60s, where there was this boom, almost like we're getting ready to see with the infrastructure bill, of building mass interchanges and mass highways and additional infrastructure. But what we did is we built highways, and I'll use Delaware as an example. We built I-95 right through the city of Wilmington. We basically separated the city, and we did it in the lowest socioeconomic demographic that didn't have a voice, or didn't have a say in where that was going to go. And you're going to see there's a lot of funding in this new infrastructure bill to try to roll back some of that and undo some of that. But going forward, you have to target your audience, right? I'll use another Delaware example. We identified in our resort areas and one of our lower counties, who are the vulnerable populations that don't come to any of our hearings or our public meetings. And it was our seniors, it was our persons with disabilities, and it was our Hispanic population, right? Some of the people in the Hispanic population were not here legally, but so they were afraid to put their 2 cents in, right? The seniors didn't have transportation to get to the hearings. So what we did is we actually went to those communities. And then, it was going meh at the beginning. And I say meh because what we were doing is we were sending the project managers, we were sending the engineers out because they knew the most about the projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are not the world's best communicators, right? So we really had to, it's not just about, identifying who your sensitive populations are, but it's communicating with them in a manner in which they understand and can actually absorb the information. So it is an entire kind of communication strategy that needs to be built around specific projects in specific areas. The same thing with public transportation. Again, we can't undo the past, right? So a lot of the public transportation, 80% of public transportation is by women and persons with disabilities and the minority community, right? And yet they were not at the planning stages of where the bus routes went or where the train stops were. So making sure that effort is happening ahead of time with the rate, and it's hard. I'm not going to sit here and say, hey, just go out and do this. It's got to be a concentrated effort. You got to make sure you have the right communicators in the right communities. I can't tell you how many Hispanic churches I've been to in the basement just to communicate, this is what's happening with this project. So Sean, a huge shout out to you for going yourself. That is not a normal task for a CEO, but it really makes the world of difference when they see that person that's the head of the organization in the basement of their church, having dinner with them, explaining what this project is. So it really takes that much of a concentrated effort, Richard, on just about definitely your major projects, but even the ones that are really going into, especially those sensitive and historically marginalized communities. Sorry, I could talk all day. So you just have to snatch me up on that one.
No, that's good. So Sean, I'd like to go back to you because you seem to be saying in the last section that you've actually started, you're actually seeing this change happen right now, right? That must be exciting.
So, I would tell you, Richard and Kyle and Jen, the most important thing I think that we all can do is just be intentional. Be intentional about who we send. be intentional about who we invite, and be intentional about listening to them and delivering for them. And Jen's example of how communities get divided, and there are people in the community where we're doing the first urban redevelopment. Instead of the big dig, it's the big build for us. If you go down any deeper, you're floating. So we can't do the big dig here in Louisiana. But there are people in the community who remembers the first time we built this, who remembers their parents losing their gas station or their grocery store, creating the food desert. And they're remembering the process of how long it took and how difficult it was to live with it. So in my commitment to them, because I was at the meeting and I heard this, my commitment was, guys, you know what? This is a 8 to 10 year construction window. Guess where we're going to start? We're going to start in this community, and we're going to deliver what they've asked for on the front end. And everybody that I talked to, my own PM staff, my engineers, the consultant, the contractor, well, you know, if we start over here, this would be a lot better. And if we could do this, this would be, no, we've violated this community once. Let's fix them first, in terms of not, and fixing them sounds horrible, but let's fix their problems first. And so we made the commitment and stuck to it. Their biggest fear, would you believe, was that we'd never finish the project. And so I was smart and said, hey guys, if we start here, the folks over there on the back end, they're going to make certain, because they're the ones that are going to write the big checks to the politicians. They're the ones that are going to be downtown. The community where we're starting, they don't have the capacity to do that. And so making that commitment started with me being in that room. It started with me sending people out to talk to them, to say, this is a Black and brown community. Who's going to go buy real estate? I'm not going to send someone who can't identify and feel comfortable sitting in these homes and expect that citizen to feel like they're being treated fairly and equitably, and that they want to do this. Because I want to be able to say yes to them more than we'll say no. And that starts with me being intentional about who I send, being intentional about who we invite to come to the meetings, and being intentional about what they tell us they want, and making sure we deliver it.
Yeah, very good. Kyle, what about your experience in the Midwest there?
Yeah, well, I just add a couple things. You know, I think that the intentional piece that Sean described is important, you know, to customize the experience or the approach for the group that you're working with. A couple of groups that I haven't heard mentioned that I thought I would. The tribal groups, you know, we have some of that, some of those groups here in Nebraska, and it takes a little bit of a different approach when you're working with them. And then sometimes people don't think of this, but very rural parts of our states, we have. I was at a meeting once where a woman said, "You can measure how rural you are by how close you are to a Walmart," and I'm 5 hours from a Walmart. And so, you know, that when that's the case, you know, holding a public meeting where you've got an ADA bathroom, you know, that nearest ADA bathroom may be 90 minutes away. And that's what was required of you when you're trying to go through the NEPA process. So, you know, maybe you have to have 2 meetings, but I think trying to customize that experience for the group you're trying to reach, recognizing that every one of those groups needs to be reached, and that you can't just roll out the same approach every single time, is what's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, I think intention is the best way of saying it. It's like, it's making sure you have people on staff that speak the language of your constituents so that they're comfortable, and things like that. All right, thanks, panel. Let's move on to our 4th topic, which is about technology. We've mentioned technology a few times already, so let's focus on that for a second. And I think social media in particular has become so ingrained in our daily lives now. I think it's important, as we've said, for agencies to kind of connect with the public where they're at. And there's this idea that, you know, public engagement, there's inbound public engagement, which is okay. So you can put a plan up on your website, you can put an email address and say, email us, come to our town hall. But there's also this idea of going out and doing outbound, being in the community, doing street surveys, doing door-to-door surveys, or those kind of things as well. So kind of a push motion. I think social media can help with this, because it's sort of digitizing the process. It's leveling the playing field. And I'd like to get the panel's sort of input on this. So Sean, maybe we can start with you in your role at Louisiana DOT and as AASHTO head. How's our community in transportation and infrastructure thinking about technology and social media in particular when it comes to?
So we're requiring it for all of our projects when you go forward that you have some comprehensive communication plan. So in our CMAR, for example, we prioritize your public outreach, not just from the design side, but from the construction side. And I don't remember who mentioned it, but you don't want to start getting into the construction and then all of a sudden find yourself on the defense. You want to be on the offense throughout the process. So on one half, we're communicating about what you want. On the second half, we're communicating with you about how we're going to deliver it, and then dealing with crisis management. The public feedback process that can be digital is so valuable because it's almost in immediate real time, and it gets to be repetitive, and it gets to be circulated to answer questions for folks who may never ask you the question. We see it all the time with the group. I'm a member of a group called Frustrated Commuters, and you get one bad story and it cycles itself 3 or 4 times in the first hour, and then every hour after that. So imagine if we were able to answer questions for folks before they ask them, because it was put there. And we've actually seen some success on Facebook where people will go to that location, or they'll go to Instagram and they will paste the answer and share it. And all of a sudden we've got some unpaid volunteer defenders of what we're trying to do, or explainers of truth and accuracy. And so the digital process is huge in terms of helping defend ourselves and maintain that position of being on the offense. And then the other piece is it's an easy way to get volumes of opinion a little bit more differently than you would if you only had 30 people show up to a meeting or a hearing. You can actually reach the other 500 people in a neighborhood if your digital literacy rate is high enough in that community. If it isn't, then you have to do some elbow grease and some pavement padding to go knock on those doors and ask them. That's why I'm so excited about taking advantage of broadband to be able to create a system to make it more available for folks in underserved communities, which are tending to be more socially distanced people, whether they're poor or minority communities, from that process, that we don't go knock on door to doors. Same thing will happen with the rural community. So I think it's an amazing tool to add nothing but value in terms of our delivery and our public expectation.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that was one of the parts of the bill that I was most excited about. I think it's over 50 billion. I think 65 billion maybe for broadband to rural and underserved areas. So that's great. Jen, same question to you.
Yes, sure. And I'm glad we brought that broadband back up, because, you know, I'm very, very proud that Delaware is actually going to be the first state in the country where every single household in the state is going to have hardwired digital broadband. And thanks to the federal funding for that to happen, because what happened, and then I'll get into the digitizing the feedback, is that when government said, you will work from home, you will learn from home, that made broadband an essential service, right? And so the states really needed to make sure that they provided that essential services. But I believe that crowdsourcing public feedback is the future of, and I think it's where all the industries are going. But I really think it's important on the transportation side, and I'll give you an example of why I say that. As part of the Delaware Department of Transportation app we partnered with Waze. Right. And governments don't like to do that. There's risk there. Right. So by partnering with Waze, we allowed the crowdsourcing information, like, OK, there's a pothole here. Watch out for this. So you guys have all used Waze, so you understand what it means. But harnessing that crowdsourcing, whether it be about a project, whether it be about, traffic situation, I think that's huge. And I just see that continuing to grow. And what another kind of byproduct of the pandemic is, people want to provide their input, right? They whatever mechanism that they can find, they want to provide that input so that they have some control of what's happening, in and around their community. So I think crowdsourcing information, whether it be feedback on projects or other things, is definitely where we're heading and where we should head. I think it's a powerful, powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl, do you concur with that, or what have you seen on the technology side?
Yeah. I would add a couple of things. I think it's important that we use the metrics that are available to us when we're using these tools to sort of define what success is, and so that we can tailor our messages and know which kinds of messages are getting the most response. I've seen some examples where you just kind of keep tweeting and it's like nobody's watching. So there are best practices. There are ways to measure your success, and I think develop those metrics and try to include them in your strategy, I think, is an important thing. And then just realizing that, you've got to be able to resource these kinds of initiatives there's nothing worse than sort of crickets, the crowd's yelling and they're not hearing back. So you got to make sure that if you're going to be intentional about providing the environments, and whether it's your Facebook page or your app on your phone, you just got to make sure you got the right resources ready to staff it, because the crowd can get going, and if they're not hearing from you, they're going to get going even worse.
Yeah, I suppose, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It can it can give you like much broader feedback, but you got to manage it, otherwise there'll be a backlash.
Yeah, and Richard, I don't think we need to be afraid of it. I just, you got to get out there, you make mistakes, you learn from them. That's part of it. You do it in a way on social media. It's kind of like, the river of life continues usually. People don't hold you to it forever, but it's okay. But also, professionalism, all those things. Sometimes, it's a learning process, but we shouldn't be afraid of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to the last of our 5 topics. And folks in the audience, please, I see we've got a couple of questions coming in. Please keep your questions coming in, and we should have about 10 minutes at the end to get to some of your folks' questions. So lastly, we're just going to chat a little bit about, what should agencies do now? What is some practical advice for folks, especially considering with the infrastructure bill that's coming? It's likely that the folks' programs are going to ramp up. They're going to have larger programs than they've had before. What should folks do right now to prepare for the infrastructure bill around this topic of public engagement? Sean, why don't we go with you first?
Well, you make a great point about dealing with this bill. And as AASHTO president, I've got a couple of priorities that absolutely resonate with this process. The first is creating pathways to equity, and that speaks to making sure our framework of this discussion with the public is one that is rooted in equity and inclusion. And then partnering to deliver is an opportunity for us to expand our conversation in the space of public outreach and public engagement. If we decide to communicate organizationally and structurally to different people, that's going to give us a richer product. And I think this administration, nationally speaking, is going to be very interested in both of those approaches and both of those issues. And if you can do that in the public engagement process, you can demonstrate that you're really leaning forward. Quantifying the value and the touch points with people and the issues, and demonstrating how you're giving them exactly what you can give them based on their feedback, I think is going to be a great success story and a great tool to tell USDOT in the discretionary fund, but also in the formula funds. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a much better product that comes out of that. And that, to me, is the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you touched on that. It's not only about the feedback during the process, it's about the feedback at the end of it, to make sure that there's alignment between what you've delivered and the public sort of accepting that. Yes, good job, or what have you. That's critical as well. Carl, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, maybe this won't come as a surprise to the folks that come to a webinar like this, but I think getting our communications experts engaged in these kinds of conversations very early, so they can be helpful when it's time to get out there is and they understand and they can help shape the entire plan, is really important. When I was a young professional, I often got into trouble because by the time I thought I should ask a lawyer, it was way too late. And I find that the same is true with communications. Like, get them there, bring them along, have them at the table when you're just sitting down and reviewing the bill from the policy perspective with your government affairs folks. I just think you can't have a communication group or person or expert involved too early, and that can help you when you're talking about these processes, so that you aren't getting ahead of yourself when the time has come. So, if you're in a public agency, get those experts at the table early.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about that. Like, so I come from a bit of a project management background. One of the things, you go to any project management course, they show you this graph of like how early you catch a problem and how much it costs you. And I think that's just, everybody gets it, right? The earlier you can catch a problem, it's going to cost you less rework, and in terms of public engagement, less angst in the community, less of a backlash, less hurt feelings or what have you. So yeah, I absolutely agree. You've got to get folks in as early as possible. Jen, we'll give you the last word on the 5 topics. What do you think agencies should be thinking about right now, top of mind?
So I think just to follow up to both Sean and Kyle, I mean, you need to have a concrete, little transportation plan, but you have to have a communication strategy, especially around your major projects. But I go back to that, that pillar of transparency. Not only do they need to be involved at the beginning of the planning stages, whether it be for public transportation or big capital infrastructure projects, but they really need to be engaged in the process, not just in the way that it's going to be relatable to them. One of the best examples that I used to give is that every year the Centers for Disease Control they always do a literacy assessment of the U.S. And basically the average person in the U.S. reads at a 7th, 8th grade level, right? So you got to know that. You got to make sure that if you are going to be doing a major project, in like using Hispanic population, because we have a significant Hispanic population in Delaware, is have the stuff translated into their language. You have to make those extra steps, and you have to customize your communication, because one size does not fit all. So I mean, it's got to be it's got to be comprehensive, it's got to be customized, it's got to be transparent, and making sure that the communities understand your project prioritization. I know I sound like a broken record player on this, but it's really important for them to understand a safety project is going to rank higher than a bike path project. So they just need to understand that. So putting that in a level of communication that people can understand. And then again, where we've failed over and over again is no offense to any engineers whatsoever, don't send an engineer into a community and expect them to understand what they're saying.
That, Jen, that reminds me of a story I heard about. It was a city in Australia. I think it was Melbourne, but don't quote me. And good participation has the potential of actually offering you a better solution at the end of the day. So what happened was in Melbourne, just outside of the CBD or downtown, there's like this historic residential area with like these old Victorian houses and stuff. And it's like a tree-lined street with these old, over 100-year-old trees. And the roots were getting too big. And so they'd broken through the pavement, they'd broken through the sidewalks, and it was really hard to drive. You couldn't ride a bicycle down on the sidewalk. People in wheelchairs could not get around. Little old ladies and men were tripping over, and it was a hazard for them. So this came through the folks that are on the disability committee at the city of Melbourne. And they sent it, they're like, okay, we've got to do something. No one can get around on this road. So they sent it over to the Public Works Department. They go and do some studies. They're looking at the trees and what can we do? And they can't really come up with anything other than, okay, we're going to pull the trees out and we're going to replace them with smaller trees that are not as invasive. So there was this huge outcry. When the public court wanted this, they were like, you're destroying our neighborhood. And these trees are like part of the whole, makeup of the city. It was a huge outcry. People on the disability committee started getting hate mail because they were like pointed as like, oh, this is your fault that like this is all happening. So big problem for the city council. So they kind of wound it back, and they started doing door to door. They went door to door. It's like, I don't know, it's like a small block, 3-4 roads, something like that. Start going door to door. Some person who's been living there for 30 years said, you guys, about 10 years ago, someone was suggesting making this a one-way street. Why don't you look into making this a one-way street? And so, which is not something the engineers were considering at all. They were looking at the trees, they were looking at the ground surface. They didn't sort of think outside of the box. So they looked at this, they did a traffic study, and they were like, oh, okay, yeah, we could, cordon this off and make this a one-way street. That way they didn't have to disturb the sidewalks. They took sort of, about half, but they took a portion of the road, repaved that, and then used that for the sidewalk and for folks to get around on. And then with a one-way street, you could drive on the other part of the street. So I just thought it was a neat story of how, like, it had a great ending that, like, once you go out into the community, you may actually end up with a better solution. And the kicker was, like, that doing it that way ended up being about a quarter of the cost of ripping the trees out and all the rest of it. So that just reminded me what you said, reminded me of that story, Jen. So we have a few minutes left. Stephanie, do we have any questions from our audience we'd like to throw the panel?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. So I guess one of them wants to know, Sean, you mentioned you guys are using Facebook and Instagram, but what other social media platforms are you using to engage your public? So I don't know, Jen and Kyle, if you guys want to touch into that, since Sean already, but are there other social media platforms that you guys are using?
We have not gone to TikTok, and I've resisted that because I'm too afraid of my kids watching me. But we do a YouTube element, and it's called Transportation Talk, where it's kind of a FaceTime with the secretary to talk about issues that are important. And then we do another one that's on YouTube, that's on the site with DOTD that we use as an educational piece. Then there are other apps that different consultants will use in our public outreach engagement process to make decisions in public meetings. And I'd be lying if I gave you the name of them, but from a department's perspective, those are the primary tools that we're using in terms of outreach. Other elements of government are using TikTok. We just haven't gotten there yet. We're not the cool department, so say, but maybe they'll convince me in my last year to just pull all the limitations off and do it.
Awesome. Well, we'll be looking forward to seeing you on TikTok then.
Yeah, I can't wait to see those dances, Sean. That'll be awesome.
Another question, which department runs public engagement in your agency and how many employees do they have? So I guess going to each agency, who runs the public engagement department?
Well, for me, I will tell you, we have a communications department that's about 8 people strong. And we have 3 PIOs that are out in our districts that are extensions of them. The actual public engagement piece is typically going to be baked into some of our mega projects as a dedicated team, or we have a larger program called Go Wider, which was a project that was started in one project, but we grew it to add other projects that if we were doing intersection improvements or capacity, road diets, you name it, that became kind of the moniker of it. It was an outside consultant firm that we used on that. But for the most part, it's going to be baked into our program management, our project management team, our consultant team, and in our innovative procurement. And then I, of course, engage in that along with planning. With regard to our statewide transportation plan, that's based in our planning division, and they've been charged with getting outside of the box in terms of non-traditional communication opportunities for that comprehensive master plan that we're working on, the update to that plan.
And then Kyle and Jen, I don't know if you guys remember who would run public engagement.
Yeah, it was in communications, and that group changed a lot over the time that I was at DOT. It's been a year since I was there, so I don't know how it's changed since then. But yeah, we had about 4 PIOs, I would say, that worked in the communications group and used consultants when we needed to as part of bigger projects, bigger efforts.
Yeah, same with Delaware. We had a community relations division that was in the office of the secretary, has about a dozen people in it. But what we did is we created the individual PIOs with geographical expertise. So, we had one assigned to each county so that they would know the inner workings of the types of communities and the individuals and the sensitive populations in those counties. So we could do the targeted outreach that we need. But some of the big projects, it was just baked into the project.
And Stephanie, I would tell you, keep in mind that the PIOs are an ongoing engagement opportunity for the department and not just project specific, whereas some of the other consultant or special project people are dedicated to engaging on that project. That's a very good distinction because our public image and branding as a department relies heavily on those PIOs, but you can mess up one of those big projects and all of their good work goes down the tube. So understanding the different roles that they play is important.
Hey, Stephanie, on that topic too, and it ties a little bit to what's going on in the chat about engineers and training them. I think one of the things we tried to do in Nebraska was ask each sort of division of the agency to have a communications plan for the year. And it's just really a chance for, our folks in the communications office, sit down with each division, whether you're, bridge engineer or a district engineer, and just think about, okay, what are my initiatives? Who are my audiences? Let's come up with a little plan. And try to keep it very easy and simple, but then something that you can get folks out and being proactive in their own constituencies that maybe aren't rising up to the level of PIO within the communications group.
Kyle, I would challenge a little bit to that conversation. I don't disagree with training engineers, but if you think about it, they really need to know how to communicate with other people, not necessarily have all the answers. Because if they're listening, remember, engineers are taught in very black and white terms of what they have. Unless they're in a wheelchair, they may not know exactly what it means compared to someone who is living that experience on a day-to-day basis. And so I would challenge us to say, not just train them how to think differently, but train them on how to communicate and listen, because several times I've had conversations with engineers and they've answered the question they wanted me to ask, as opposed to the question, I don't need to know how to build a clock. I just need to know what time it is. That takes a listening skill much more than a designing skill. So I think a combination of what's said in the chat, but also think about how that's applied by saying, talk to other people in your building, in your department. There are people who don't even want to use cars. You know, there are people who live without vehicles. There are people that we need to talk to, and the engineers need to design for them as well in what they do.
I agree, Sean. It's back to that sort of where we started, right? The tone,
Yeah.
you know, how you approach these kinds of things. It's changing and it needs to keep going.
Yes. Well, that is it for today. And sorry, I had to cut you guys off, but thank you guys so much for touching on the engineering side, because yes, we definitely need to train engineers, but also, like you all touched on, great communication. But this concludes our webinar. And also, if you're interested in another webinar, we will be hosting Women in Transportation, Beating the Bias, end of March. So be on the lookout. We'll have that webinar. But I want to thank everybody once again. Thanks to our panelists, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks,
you.
Stephanie. Thanks, panel.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.